Dr. Wilhelm Kruger's hands trembled as he watched American soldiers collapse around him, their blood mixing with the mud of a makeshift field hospital. Just hours earlier, he had been treating German wounded behind enemy lines. Now, captured and expecting the worst, an American colonel looked him straight in the eye and said words that would haunt him forever. "We need every hand we can get." What happened next defied everything he thought he knew about war, humanity, and the thin line between enemy and healer. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of October 15, 1944, began with the thunderous roar of Allied artillery pounding the ancient walls of Aachen. Dr. Wilhelm Kruger pressed his stethoscope against the chest of a 19-year-old Wehrmacht soldier, whose breathing had become increasingly labored throughout the night. The basement of what had once been St. Mary's Hospital now served as an improvised medical station, its stone walls offering minimal protection from the relentless bombardment above. Dust cascaded from the ceiling with each explosion, settling on surgical instruments that gleamed dully in the flickering candlelight. "His lung is punctured," Kruger muttered to his colleague, Dr. Ernst Falk, who was hunched over another patient nearby. The younger doctor's usually pristine white coat was now stained with blood and grime, a testament to the 3 days they had spent operating without rest. "Without proper equipment, there's nothing more I can do." Falk looked up from the soldier he was treating, his blue eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and determination. At 32, he was 5 years younger than Kruger, but had already established himself as one of Berlin's most promising surgeons before the war swept him into military service. "The morphine is almost gone too," he said quietly, careful not to let the wounded men hear their conversation. "And we're down to our last few vials of sulfa powder." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the narrow corridor that led to their makeshift operating room. Both doctors froze, recognizing the heavy boots of American soldiers. They had known this moment would come. The German defense of Aachen was crumbling, and surrender was inevitable. Kruger carefully placed his stethoscope in his medical bag, wondering if he would ever use it again. "Hands up! Everybody out!" The voice was gruff, commanding, and spoke in heavily accented German. 3 American GIs appeared in the doorway, their rifles trained on the medical personnel. Behind them stood a sergeant with weathered features and intelligent brown eyes that quickly assessed the scene before him. Kruger raised his hand slowly, his mind racing. He had heard stories about what happened to captured German doctors, particularly those who had served on the Eastern Front. Some had been executed as war criminals, others sent to labor camps where medical knowledge meant nothing and survival depended solely on physical strength. He glanced at Falk, who had also raised his hands but was staring defiantly at their captors. "You are doctors?" the sergeant asked in broken German, gesturing toward the medical equipment scattered around the room. "Yes," Kruger replied in English, surprising the Americans with his fluency. "We are physicians. These men need medical attention." The sergeant studied him for a moment, then spoke rapidly into a radio handset. Within minutes, more soldiers arrived, along with an American medic who began examining the German wounded. Kruger watched in amazement as the medic administered morphine and began treating injuries without regard for nationality. "You're coming with us," the sergeant announced. "Bring your medical bags." The journey to the American lines took less than an hour, but it felt like an eternity to Kruger. He and Falk were loaded into a jeep alongside their captors, bouncing over roads pockmarked with shell craters and littered with the debris of war. The October air was crisp and carried the acrid smell of cordite and burning buildings. As they drove through what remained of Aachen's commercial district, Kruger saw American medics moving through the rubble, searching for wounded soldiers from both sides. Their destination was a large canvas structure that had been erected in what was once the city's main square. The Red Cross painted on its roof was visible from several blocks away, and a constant stream of jeeps and ambulances delivered wounded soldiers to its entrance. As they approached, Kruger could hear the sounds that were all too familiar to any battlefield surgeon: moans of pain, urgent commands, and the metallic clatter of surgical instruments. "Welcome to hell," muttered one of their guards as they climbed out of the jeep. Inside the field hospital, chaos reigned supreme. Dozens of stretchers lined the main area, occupied by wounded soldiers whose injuries ranged from minor shrapnel wounds to devastating blast injuries that required immediate surgical intervention. American medics and doctors moved between the patients with practiced efficiency, but it was clear that they were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of casualties. Colonel Benjamin Carter emerged from what appeared to be the main surgical tent, his green fatigues stained with blood and his face etched with exhaustion. At 45, he was a veteran of both the North African and Italian campaigns, and his reputation as a battlefield surgeon was legendary among the medical corps. His gray eyes immediately fixed on the two German doctors, studying them with the intensity of a man who had learned to make life-and-death decisions in seconds. "You're the German doctors from St. Mary's?" he asked in perfect German, causing both Kruger and Falk to look up in surprise. "Yes, sir," Kruger replied. "Dr. Wilhelm Kruger, and this is Dr. Ernst Falk." Carter nodded curtly. "I've been told you were treating wounded soldiers when our men found you. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir. We had been operating for 3 days straight." The American colonel studied them for another long moment, then made a decision that would change all their lives. "We need every hand we can get," he said simply. "I'm asking you to help us treat these men." Kruger felt as if he had been struck by lightning. Of all the scenarios he had imagined for his capture, this was not one of them. Beside him, Falk's mouth had fallen open in shock. "You want us to treat American soldiers?" Falk asked incredulously. "I want you to treat wounded human beings," Carter replied firmly. "Some of them happen to be American, some British, some Canadian, some are German." He gestured toward a section of the hospital where several Wehrmacht soldiers lay on stretchers. "In this tent, there are no enemies, only patients." The invitation, if it could be called that, came with conditions. The German doctors would work under constant supervision, their movements restricted to the hospital area. Any attempt to escape or communicate with German forces would result in immediate court-martial. But for men who had dedicated their lives to healing, the opportunity to practice medicine, even under these circumstances, was irresistible. Kruger's first patient was a 20-year-old private from Ohio who had stepped on a mine while clearing a roadblock. The explosion had shattered his left leg below the knee, and infection was already setting in. As Kruger examined the wound, cleaning away dead tissue and assessing the extent of the damage, he was acutely aware of the American medic watching his every move. "The bone is badly fractured," he reported to the supervising American surgeon, Dr. Robert Hayes. "But I believe we can save the leg if we act quickly." Hayes, a soft-spoken man from Massachusetts who had been practicing emergency medicine since before the war, nodded his approval. "What do you need?" "Fresh sulfa powder, morphine for pain management, and proper surgical tools for debridement," Kruger replied without hesitation. As he worked, Kruger found himself falling into the familiar rhythm of surgery. The nationality of his patient became irrelevant as he focused entirely on the technical challenges of the operation. He carefully removed bone fragments, cleaned the wound thoroughly, and began the delicate process of setting the remaining bone. The young American soldier, semi-conscious from morphine, mumbled something about his mother. "He's asking for his mother," the supervising medic translated unnecessarily. Kruger nodded grimly. "They all do," he said quietly. "German, American, it doesn't matter. When they're hurt and afraid, they all call for their mothers." The operation took nearly 3 hours, during which time Kruger became increasingly aware of the paradox of his situation. This same soldier might have been shooting at his countrymen just days earlier, yet now Kruger was fighting to save his life with the same dedication he would have shown to any German patient. The moral complexities of war had never seemed more apparent than in this moment, when healing transcended the artificial boundaries of nationality and ideology. Meanwhile, at the other end of the hospital, Falk was dealing with his own philosophical crisis. His patient was a British sergeant who had suffered severe burns when his tank caught fire during the assault on Aachen's outer defenses. The man's hands were badly damaged, and there was a real possibility that he would lose several fingers if proper reconstructive surgery wasn't performed immediately. "I've seen this type of injury before," Falk explained to the American surgeon overseeing his work. During the bombing of Berlin, many civilians suffered similar burns. The key is to preserve as much functional tissue as possible while preventing infection. As he worked, Falk found himself thinking about the burned children he had treated in Berlin's hospitals during the Allied bombing raids. The irony was not lost on him that he was now treating injuries inflicted by the same forces that had devastated his homeland. Yet, as he carefully debrided the burned tissue and began the process of skin grafting, he felt the same sense of purpose that had driven him to become a doctor in the first place. The days that followed established a routine that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Kruger and Falk reported to the field hospital each morning under armed guard, worked alongside American and British medical personnel throughout the day, and returned to a guarded tent in the evening. The work was exhausting and emotionally draining, but both men found it oddly comforting to return to the practice of medicine after months of serving primarily as military officers. Their reputation among the Allied medical staff began to grow as word spread of their skill and dedication. Dr. Hayes, initially skeptical of working with enemy physicians, found himself increasingly impressed by Kruger's surgical technique and diagnostic abilities. The German doctor's experience treating battlefield injuries proved invaluable in dealing with the complex trauma cases that arrived daily. "I have to admit," Hayes confided to Colonel Carter one evening, "Kruger probably knows more about treating blast injuries than any surgeon I've worked with. His experience on the Eastern Front gives him insights we simply don't have." Carter, who had been monitoring the German doctor's work closely, was facing his own moral dilemma. Military regulations clearly stated that prisoners of war should not be given access to sensitive information or allowed to participate in military operations. Yet the reality of battlefield medicine made such distinctions seem absurdly bureaucratic. Every life saved was a victory, regardless of who wielded the scalpel. The breakthrough at acceptance came during the hospital's busiest day yet. A massive German counterattack had resulted in heavy casualties on both sides, and wounded soldiers were arriving faster than the medical staff could treat them. In the controlled chaos of triage, artificial boundaries began to dissolve entirely. Kruger found himself working on a young American lieutenant who had suffered a severe head injury from shrapnel. The wound was complex, requiring delicate surgery to remove metal fragments that had penetrated the skull without damaging vital brain tissue. As he worked, he was dimly aware that several American surgeons had gathered to observe his technique. "The key is to approach from this angle," he explained, his English becoming more fluent as he concentrated on the surgery. "The fragment has lodged near the motor cortex, but if we're careful, we can extract it without causing permanent paralysis." The operation was a complete success, and when the young lieutenant regained consciousness 2 days later with full motor function intact, word spread quickly through the medical corps. The German prisoner had saved an American officer's life, and had done so with a skill that few Allied surgeons could have matched. Falk, meanwhile, was making his own contribution to breaking down barriers. His specialty in reconstructive surgery proved invaluable in treating the severe facial injuries that were becoming increasingly common, as German defensive positions included more improvised explosive chemical devices. His gentle manner with patients, combined with his obvious skill, won over even the most skeptical American medics. "He talks to them," observed Sergeant Mike O'Connor, one of the senior medics. "Even when they can't understand his English, he finds ways to communicate. You can see the fear leave their eyes when he starts working on them." The transformation in attitude was gradual but unmistakable. Where once the German doctors had been viewed with suspicion and barely concealed hostility, they were now regarded as valuable members of the medical team. American soldiers began requesting treatment from the German doc when word spread of Kruger's surgical successes. However, this acceptance was not universal. Some soldiers and medical personnel remained deeply suspicious of the German physicians, viewing their cooperation as either a calculated attempt to avoid punishment or a more sinister form of espionage. Lieutenant David Morrison, a young medical officer from Chicago, was particularly vocal in his opposition to the arrangement. "I don't care how good they are," Morrison argued during a heated discussion in the officers' mess. "They're Nazis. They've been treating our enemies for years while our boys died on operating tables because they didn't have proper medical care. Colonel Carter listened to these objections with patience, but remained firm in his position. "These men are doctors first," he replied calmly. "Whatever their political beliefs, whatever uniform they wore, they've taken the same oath we have. I've watched them work, and I've seen them save lives. That's what matters in this hospital." The debate reflected a larger struggle within the Allied forces as victory in Europe began to seem inevitable. How would they deal with German prisoners? How could they distinguish between committed Nazis and ordinary soldiers who had been conscripted into service? The case of the two German doctors was a microcosm of these larger questions. For Kruger and Falk, the philosophical implications of their situation were equally complex. Both men had served the Wehrmacht faithfully, believing they were defending their homeland against invasion. Yet their time in the American hospital had exposed them to a different perspective on the war. They saw American medics risking their lives to save German wounded, witnessed the genuine grief of Allied soldiers when patients died, and observed a level of medical professionalism that transcended national boundaries. The moment that crystallized this transformation came 3 weeks into their captivity. A massive artillery bombardment had targeted German positions east of the city, but several rounds had fallen short, landing dangerously close to the field hospital. As medical personnel scrambled to evacuate patients to safer areas, Kruger found himself face to face with a dilemma that would define the rest of his life. A young German soldier, barely 18 years old, had been brought in with severe abdominal injuries. The boy was conscious and clearly terrified, calling out in German for someone to help him. Several American medics were trying to stabilize him, but they were struggling to communicate and clearly didn't understand the extent of his injuries. Without hesitation, Kruger approached the stretcher and began speaking to the boy in German, calming him while simultaneously assessing his condition. The abdominal wound was severe, but survivable with immediate surgery. However, the American surgeons were all occupied with other critical cases, and the boy would likely die before they could get to him. "I need to operate immediately," Kruger announced to the supervising medic. "You're not authorized to work without direct supervision," came the reply. Kruger looked down at the wounded German soldier, then at the chaos surrounding them. American, British, and German wounded were scattered throughout the hospital, all requiring immediate attention from an overwhelmed medical staff. In that moment, the artificial constraints of military protocol seemed not just absurd, but immoral. "Then, supervise me," he said firmly, already moving toward the surgical area. "But this boy dies if we don't act now." The surgery was performed under the loosest possible supervision, with an American medic observing while remaining focused primarily on his own patients. Kruger worked with calm efficiency, repairing damaged intestines and stopping internal bleeding, while the sounds of continuing artillery fire echoed overhead. When he finally sutured the last incision, both he and his impromptu assistant were exhausted but triumphant. The young German soldier survived and would eventually be repatriated to Germany after the war. But for Kruger, the operation represented something more significant than medical success. It was the moment when he truly understood that healing could transcend the artificial boundaries imposed by war and politics. Falk experienced his own moment of revelation while treating a captured SS officer who had been severely beaten during his capture. The man's injuries were extensive, including several broken ribs, a fractured skull, and internal bleeding. More significantly, he was a member of an organization that both German doctors knew had committed terrible atrocities throughout Europe. "Why are you helping him?" asked Sergeant O'Connor, who was assisting with the treatment. Falk paused in his examination, considering the question carefully. "Because he's a human being who is suffering," he replied finally. "Whatever he has done, whatever he believes, right now, he's just a patient who needs medical care." The SS officer survived his injuries and was eventually transferred to a prisoner of war camp. Whether Falk's treatment changed the man's perspective on the war or his ideology was impossible to know. But for Falk, the experience reinforced his growing belief that medicine represented a higher calling than nationalism or politics. As autumn turned to winter, the character of the war began to change dramatically. German resistance was collapsing across multiple fronts, and it became increasingly clear that the conflict in Europe would end within months. For the medical personnel in the Aachen field hospital, this meant a gradual reduction in the number of combat casualties, but an increase in other types of medical challenges. Civilian refugees began arriving in increasing numbers, many suffering from malnutrition, disease, and the psychological trauma of displacement. German civilians, who had initially viewed the American medical personnel with suspicion and fear, gradually began to trust the field hospital as word spread of the compassionate treatment being provided. Kruger found himself serving as an unofficial liaison between the American medical staff and the German civilian population. His fluency in English and his understanding of American medical procedures made him invaluable in bridging cultural and linguistic gaps. More importantly, his presence reassured German civilians that they would receive proper medical care despite their nationality. One case in particular highlighted the evolution in relationships within the hospital. An elderly German woman arrived suffering from severe pneumonia, complicated by underlying heart disease. Her condition was critical, and survival depended on receiving modern antibiotics that were in short supply. Under normal wartime protocols, such medications would be reserved for military personnel. Colonel Carter made the decision to authorize treatment with penicillin, one of the newest and most effective antibiotics available. The decision was controversial among some members of his staff, who questioned the wisdom of using scarce medical resources on enemy civilians. But Carter's reasoning was simple. The woman was a patient who could be saved, and saving lives was what doctors did. Kruger administered the treatment personally, monitoring the woman's progress closely over the following days. Her recovery was slow but steady, and within 2 weeks, she was well enough to be discharged to a civilian refugee center. Before leaving, she approached Kruger with tears in her eyes and spoke in German. She says she wants to thank the American doctors, Kruger translated. She says she never expected such kindness from enemy soldiers. Carter nodded solemnly. Tell her that's what we're here for. The exchange was observed by several American medics, and word of it spread quickly through the hospital. For many, it represented a validation of their decision to work alongside the German doctors. Medical ethics, they realized, transcended national boundaries and political ideologies. As winter deepened, both German doctors began to receive correspondence from their families back home. The letters, heavily censored by Allied authorities, provided glimpses of life in a Germany that was rapidly collapsing under the weight of military defeat and economic devastation. For both men, these communications served as painful reminders of the world they had left behind and might never see again. Kruger learned that his wife and 2 children had evacuated from Berlin to his brother's farm in Bavaria, where they were safe but struggling with food shortages and the uncertainty of an increasingly chaotic situation. Falk discovered that his parents' home in Munich had been destroyed in an Allied bombing raid, though his family had survived and was living with relatives. These personal connections to the broader tragedy of war created additional emotional complexity for both doctors. They were healing American soldiers who were fighting to destroy their homeland, while their own families suffered under the consequences of a conflict they had not chosen, but were powerless to end. The psychological strain was evident in both men. Kruger became increasingly withdrawn during his off-duty hours, spending long periods writing in a journal that he kept hidden from his guards. Falk threw himself into his work with even greater intensity, often volunteering for additional shifts and taking on the most challenging surgical cases. Colonel Carter, recognizing the signs of psychological stress, arranged for both men to meet with Captain Ruth Henderson, a psychiatrist who had been attached to the medical unit specifically to deal with combat trauma. The sessions were voluntary and confidential, designed to help the German doctors process the complex emotions associated with their situation. "What troubles you most?" Henderson asked Kruger during one of their sessions. Kruger considered the question carefully before answering. "The contradiction," he said finally. "I save American lives during the day, then return to my tent at night and worry about American bombs falling on my family. How do I reconcile these two realities?" Henderson nodded sympathetically. "War creates impossible moral situations," she replied. "But you can only control your own actions. Are you comfortable with the choices you're making?" I believe in what I'm doing here, Kruger said firmly. But I struggle with what it means for my identity as a German. Similar conversations with Falk revealed comparable internal conflicts. The younger doctor was particularly troubled by guilt over his survival, while so many of his medical school classmates had died on various battlefields. The opportunity to practice medicine in relative safety felt simultaneously like a blessing and a betrayal of his fallen colleagues. These therapy sessions, while helpful for psychological health, also served to reinforce the growing bonds between the German doctors and their American colleagues. Henderson regularly reported to Colonel Carter on the mental state of both prisoners, and her assessments consistently emphasized their genuine commitment to medical ethics and their value as members of the medical burr team. The turning point in public perception came during a surprise inspection by General Harrison Brooks, the commanding officer responsible for all medical facilities in the European theater. Brooks, a career military officer with little patience for unconventional arrangements, had come to investigate reports of German prisoners being allowed to practice medicine on Allied personnel. The inspection occurred during one of the hospital's busiest periods, with a steady stream of casualties arriving from ongoing operations along the German border. Brooks arrived unannounced and immediately began questioning the use of enemy prisoners in medical roles. "Colonel Carter," he began formally, "I need to understand exactly what's happening here." Carter provided a detailed explanation of the arrangement, emphasizing the critical shortage of medical personnel and the proven competence of both German doctors. As he spoke, Brooks observed the hospital operations, watching as Kruger performed surgery on a wounded Canadian soldier, while Falk treated a British airman suffering from severe burns. "What's their success rate?" Brooks asked. "Higher than average," Carter replied honestly. "Dr. Kruger has an exceptional understanding of trauma surgery, and Dr. Falk's reconstructive work is the best I've seen in 30 years of medicine." The general's inspection continued for several hours, during which he spoke directly with patients who had been treated by the German doctors. The testimonials were uniformly positive, with several soldiers crediting Kruger and Falk with saving their lives or preserving critical functions that might otherwise have been lost. The decisive moment came when Brooks observed Kruger performing emergency surgery on a young American sergeant who had suffered a severe chest wound. The operation was complex, requiring precise coordination between surgeon and surgical team to repair damage to multiple organs, while maintaining cardiovascular stability. As Brooks watched, he became increasingly impressed by the German doctor's technical skill and the seamless cooperation between Kruger and the American surgical team. When the operation was completed successfully and the patient's vital signs stabilized, Brooks approached the surgical table. "Excellent work, doctor," he said simply. Kruger, still focused on his patient, looked up in surprise. It was the first time a senior Allied officer had addressed him with professional respect rather than as a prisoner of war. "Thank you, sir," he replied. Brooks turned to Colonel Carter. "Continue with your current arrangements," he said formally. "These men are assets, not liabilities." The general's endorsement effectively ended any official opposition to the German doctor's participation in Allied medical operations. Word of Brooks' approval spread quickly through military medical channels, and other field hospitals began requesting permission to employ captured German medical personnel in similar capacities. For Kruger and Falk, the validation was emotionally significant, but also brought new responsibilities. They were now officially recognized as contributing members of the Allied medical effort, with expanded privileges and greater freedom of movement within the hospital complex. More importantly, they were increasingly called upon to serve as cultural ambassadors, helping to bridge the gap between Allied medical personnel and German civilian patients. The role of cultural liaison became increasingly important as spring arrived and Germany's final collapse accelerated. Civilian casualties began to outnumber military ones, as desperate German forces made increasingly destructive defensive stands in populated areas. The medical challenges shifted from treating combat injuries to dealing with malnutrition, disease, and the complex trauma associated with the breakdown of civil society. Kruger found himself serving as the primary interpreter for German civilian patients, many of whom spoke no English and were terrified of receiving medical treatment from enemy forces. His calm demeanor and obvious medical competence helped reassure patients and their families, while his translations ensured that American doctors understood the full extent of medical histories and symptoms. One particularly challenging case involved a German mother and her 3 children who had been caught in artillery fire while fleeing their home. The mother had suffered severe burns while shielding her children from the blast, and all 4 patients required extensive medical treatment. The woman was conscious but hysterical, convinced that the American doctors intended to harm her children. Kruger spent hours at her bedside, alternately translating for the medical team and reassuring the terrified mother that her children were receiving the best possible care. When infection set in and her condition became critical, he remained with her throughout the night, monitoring her vital signs and adjusting treatments as needed. The woman survived, as did all 3 of her children, though their recovery took several weeks. During that time, Kruger served as their primary advocate within the hospital system, ensuring that they received proper nutrition, psychological support, and preparation for eventual placement in civilian POW refugee centers. The case was emotionally draining for all involved, but it also demonstrated the profound transformation that had occurred within the field hospital. American medics who had initially viewed German patients with suspicion now worked alongside Kruger to provide compassionate care to enemy civilians. The barriers of nationality and ideology had been replaced by a shared commitment to healing and human dignity. Falk experienced a similar evolution in his relationship with Allied personnel. His specialty in reconstructive surgery made him particularly valuable in treating the facial injuries that had become common among both military and civilian casualties. His gentle approach with disfigured patients, combined with his technical expertise, earned him recognition as one of the most skilled surgeons in the medical unit. The respect was mutual. Falk found himself genuinely impressed by the professionalism and dedication of his American and British colleagues. The stereotype of Allied forces as brutal conquerors had been replaced by his direct experience of medical professionals who shared his commitment to healing and his respect for human dignity. This personal transformation was perhaps most evident in his relationship with Dr. Hayes, the American surgeon who had initially supervised his work with considerable skepticism. Over the months of working together, the 2 men had developed a genuine professional friendship based on mutual respect and shared medical interests. "I have to admit," Hayes confided one evening, "working with you has changed my perspective on this war. I came here thinking all Germans were fanatical Nazis. You've shown me that's not true." Falk nodded thoughtfully. "And you've shown me that American soldiers are not the heartless conquerors our propaganda portrayed. We are all just people trying to do our jobs and survive this terrible conflict." These personal relationships became increasingly important as the war in Europe drew to a close. News of Germany's surrender reached the field hospital on May 8, 1945, creating a complex mixture of relief, celebration, and uncertainty about the future. For the Allied medical personnel, the end of hostilities meant the eventual closure of field hospitals and return to civilian life. For the German doctors, it raised difficult questions about their ultimate fate. As prisoners of war, they would likely be repatriated to Germany eventually, but the timeline and conditions remained uncertain. Colonel Carter called both men into his office the day after Germany's surrender to discuss their future status. The conversation was informal, but laden with emotional significance for all involved. "The war is over," Carter began simply. "Your status as prisoners of war will continue until formal repatriation procedures are established. But your work here has been invaluable. I want you to know that I will personally recommend both of you for favorable treatment during the transition period." Kruger and Falk exchanged glances, both understanding the significance of Carter's words. A positive recommendation from a senior Allied medical officer could mean the difference between rapid repatriation and extended imprisonment. "We are grateful for the opportunity to serve," Kruger replied formally. "This experience has taught us that medicine transcends nationality and politics. We hope we can continue to serve humanity, whatever the future holds." The final weeks at the field hospital were bittersweet for all involved. Casualties continued to arrive, though in smaller numbers, as Allied forces dealt with displaced persons, civilian medical emergencies, and the complex logistics of occupying defeated territory. The German doctors continued their medical duties while preparing emotionally for separation from colleagues who had become genuine friends. The relationships forged during those months of shared service proved to be lasting. Dr. Hayes promised to write recommendations for both German doctors, emphasizing their professional competence and personal integrity. Other Allied medical personnel made similar commitments, understanding that such documentation might prove crucial in helping their former enemies rebuild their lives in post-war Germany. Colonel Carter went further, arranging for both men to receive copies of their medical records and documentation of the surgeries they had performed. Such records would be invaluable in re-establishing their medical careers once they returned to civilian life. "You've been outstanding physicians and decent human beings," Carter told them during their final formal meeting. "Whatever happened before you came here, whatever political beliefs you may have held, your actions in this hospital have demonstrated your fundamental humanity. I hope you can build on that foundation as you return to your families and your careers." The parting was emotional for everyone involved. American medics who had initially viewed the German doctors with suspicion now shook hands warmly and exchanged contact information for possible future correspondence. Patients who had been treated by Kruger and Falk requested opportunities to thank them personally before their departure. Most significantly, several American doctors expressed interest in continuing professional relationships after the war. Dr. Hayes invited both men to correspond with him about medical developments and research opportunities. Others suggested the possibility of collaborative medical research projects that might help advance surgical techniques developed during the conflict. The transport that would take Kruger and Falk to a repatriation center arrived on a gray morning in late June. As they loaded their few possessions into the military truck, both men took final looks at the field hospital that had become their professional and emotional home for 8 months. The experience had transformed them both in profound ways. They had entered captivity as defeated enemy soldiers, expecting punishment, or at best, indifferent treatment. Instead, they had found professional respect, genuine friendship, and a renewed faith in the universal values that transcended national boundaries and political ideologies. For the Allied medical personnel who remained behind, the departure of the German doctors marked the end of an extraordinary chapter in their own professional lives. They had learned that healing could indeed transcend the artificial divisions created by war, and that shared commitment to medical ethics could overcome even the deepest political differences. Colonel Carter watched the transport disappear into the distance, then returned to his duties with a sense of satisfaction mixed with melancholy. The experiment in medical cooperation had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, demonstrating that human dignity and professional integrity could survive even the most brutal conflicts. Years later, when asked about his decision to allow enemy doctors to treat Allied wounded, Carter would always give the same response: "They were doctors first, everything else second. In the end, that's all that mattered." Thus, the stories of Dr. Wilhelm Kruger and Dr. Ernst Falk did not end with their repatriation to Germany. Both men successfully rebuilt their medical careers in the post-war period, carrying with them the lessons learned during their months in American captivity. They maintained correspondence with several of their former Allied colleagues, and their experiences contributed to the gradual reconciliation between former enemies that characterized the post-war reconstruction of Europe. Their time in the American field hospital had planted seeds of understanding that would continue to grow for decades to come, proving that even in humanity's darkest hours, healing and reconciliation remain possible for those with the courage to reach across the artificial boundaries created by conflict and hatred. The trust placed in them by Colonel Carter and his medical team had not been misplaced, and their response to that trust had demonstrated that professional ethics and human decency could transcend even the most bitter divisions of war. The journey to the repatriation center took 3 days, winding through the devastated landscape of Western Germany. Kruger and Falk found themselves in a convoy with hundreds of other German prisoners, but their status as medical personnel afforded them slightly better treatment than the average Wehrmacht soldier. They rode in the back of a covered truck with other professional prisoners, including teachers, engineers, and civil servants, who would eventually be processed for return to civilian life. During the long hours of travel, Kruger found himself reflecting on the profound changes in his worldview that had occurred during his captivity. 8 months earlier, he had been a loyal Wehrmacht officer, convinced that Germany was fighting a defensive war against foreign aggressors. Now, having worked alongside Allied medical personnel and witnessed their genuine commitment to healing all patients regardless of nationality, he struggled to reconcile his previous beliefs with his new, bold understanding. The landscape through which they traveled told its own story of the war's devastation. Cities lay in ruins, their ancient cathedrals and modern factories reduced to rubble by months of Allied bombing. Refugees clogged the roads, pushing handcarts loaded with their remaining possessions, or simply walking with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The sight of such widespread destruction forced both doctors to confront the human cost of the conflict they had served. "Look at what we've done to ourselves," Falk murmured as they passed through what had once been the industrial city of Dortmund. The skeletal remains of factories stretched as far as the eye could see, their twisted metal frames reaching toward the sky like the ribs of some enormous beast. Kruger nodded grimly. "And look at what we've done to others," he replied, thinking of the stories he had heard from Allied medical personnel about the destruction of cities across Europe, the displacement of millions of civilians, and the systematic persecution of entire populations. The conversations during that journey were subdued but significant. For the first time since their capture, both men had the opportunity to process their experiences without the constant pressure of medical duties or the watchful eyes of Allied supervisors. They spoke quietly about the patients they had treated, the relationships they had formed, and the difficult questions about identity and loyalty that their cooperation with Allied forces had raised. "Do you think we were traitors?" Falk asked during one particularly introspective moment. Kruger considered the question carefully before answering. "I think we were doctors," he said finally. "We did what doctors are supposed to do. We healed the sick and injured, regardless of who they were or what uniform they wore. If that makes us traitors to some political ideology, then perhaps the ideology was wrong. To begin with." The repatriation center was located in a former Wehrmacht training facility near Frankfurt, now converted to house thousands of German prisoners awaiting processing for return to civilian life. The facilities were basic but adequate, with dormitory-style housing, communal dining areas, and administrative offices where former prisoners underwent extensive interviews designed to assess their suitability for release. Upon arrival, Kruger and Falk were immediately separated from the general population of prisoners and assigned to a special section reserved for professional personnel. This classification brought both advantages and additional scrutiny. While they enjoyed better living conditions and more frequent contact with family members, they also faced more intensive questioning about their wartime activities and political beliefs. The interrogation process was thorough but fair, conducted by Allied intelligence officers who had been briefed on their medical service during captivity. Major Patricia Williams, a former prosecutor from Philadelphia who now served as a denazification specialist, was assigned to evaluate both doctors for potential war crimes involvement and assess their fitness for return to medical practice. "Dr. Kruger," Williams began during their first formal interview, "I need to understand your military service record before your capture. What units did you serve with, and what was the nature of your duties?" Kruger provided a detailed account of his military medical service, beginning with his assignment to a field hospital on the Eastern Front in 1942. He described the brutal conditions he had encountered there, the overwhelming number of casualties, and his gradual disillusionment with the conduct of the war as reports of atrocities committed by SS units and other German forces became impossible to ignore. "I was a doctor, not a combat soldier," he explained. "My duty was to treat wounded soldiers, both German and Soviet, when prisoners were brought to our facility. I never participated in combat operations or witnessed any war crimes personally, though I heard by rumors that troubled me deeply." Williams made careful notes, cross-referencing his account with intelligence reports and testimony from other prisoners who had served in similar capacities. The investigation revealed no evidence of war crimes or inappropriate conduct during his military service, but it did uncover information that would prove significant in understanding his character and motivations. Several Soviet prisoners who were treated at your field hospital have provided testimony about your conduct, Williams informed him during a subsequent interview. They describe you as professional and compassionate, treating their injuries with the same care you provided to German soldiers. Is this accurate? Kruger felt a wave of relief mixed with vindication. Yes, Major. I believe medical ethics transcend nationality and politics. A wounded soldier is a patient first, everything else second. Similar interviews with Falk revealed a comparable record of professional conduct and humanitarian behavior. His service with a Wehrmacht medical unit in France had been characterized by proper treatment of civilian casualties and Allied prisoners, with several French civilians providing testimony about his compassionate care during the liberation of Paris. The formal denazification process took several weeks, during which both doctors participated in educational programs designed to help former Wehrmacht personnel understand the broader context of the war and Germany's responsibility for the massive destruction and loss of life. These sessions were sometimes difficult, as they were forced to confront evidence of atrocities committed by German forces throughout Europe. The revelation of the Holocaust was particularly traumatic for both men. While they had heard rumors of persecution against Jewish populations, the full extent of the systematic extermination program came as a profound shock. Kruger found himself physically ill after viewing documentary footage of concentration camps liberated by Allied forces. How did we not know? He asked Falk after one particularly harrowing educational session. How could something like this happen without the knowledge of ordinary German citizens? Falk shook his head slowly. Perhaps we didn't want to know, he replied quietly. Perhaps it was easier to focus on our medical duties and ignore the larger questions about what our government was doing. These revelations forced both men to reevaluate not only their wartime service, but their entire understanding of German society and their place within it. The country they would return to was not only physically devastated but morally bankrupt, its fundamental values called into question by the evidence of systematic criminality at the highest levels of government. Psychological impact of these discoveries was profound and lasting. Both doctors entered therapy sessions provided by Allied psychological services, working through feelings of guilt, shame, and confusion about their identity as Germans and as medical professionals who had served a criminal regime. Dr. Margaret Foster, a British psychiatrist assigned to work with German professional personnel, helped both men process these complex emotions. You cannot be held responsible for crimes you did not commit or even know about, she told them during group therapy sessions. But you do have a responsibility to use your knowledge and experience to help rebuild Germany into a nation that can never again permit such atrocities. The therapy sessions also provided an opportunity for both doctors to discuss their experiences in Allied captivity and the relationships they had formed with American medical personnel. Foster was particularly interested in understanding how their cooperation with former enemies had affected their psychological and emotional development. Working with the Americans changed us, Kruger admitted during one session. Before our capture, we saw them as enemies to be defeated. Afterward, we saw them as colleagues and even friends. That transformation has made it impossible to think about conflict in the same way. Falk agreed, adding that his experience had fundamentally altered his understanding of patriotism and professional duty. I used to believe that loyalty to my country meant following orders without question, he said. Now I understand that true patriotism sometimes requires questioning authority and standing up for universal human values. These insights would prove crucial in their eventual reintegration into German society. Both men were developing a perspective that would help them contribute to the moral and ethical reconstruction of their homeland. Moving beyond the narrow nationalism that had contributed to the war's devastation, the repatriation process was complicated by the chaotic conditions in post-war Germany. The country had been divided into 4 occupation zones, controlled respectively by American, British, French, and Soviet forces. Kruger's family was located in the American zone in Bavaria, while Falk's relatives lived in the British zone near Hamburg. This geographical separation would affect their processing timelines and eventual release dates. During their time at the repatriation center, Both doctors maintained correspondence with their families and with several of their former Allied colleagues. Letters from Dr. Hayes provided updates on medical developments and research opportunities that might be available in post-war Germany. Colonel Carter wrote to recommend both men for medical positions with international relief organizations working to address the humanitarian crisis in Central Europe. These letters of recommendation proved invaluable when both doctors were eventually cleared for release in September 1945. The documentation of their service in Allied medical facilities, combined with positive evaluations from their denazification proceedings, positioned them advantageously for rapid reintegration into civilian medical practice. Kruger's release came first, as his destination in the American zone simplified the administrative procedures. The reunion with his wife Martha and their two children, Klaus and Anna, was emotionally overwhelming for all involved. The family had not seen each other for nearly 2 years, and the children had grown significantly during their father's absence. "You look different, Papa," 10-year-old Anna observed during their first evening together at his brother's farm outside Munich. "Your eyes are different." Kruger hugged his daughter tightly, understanding that she was perceptive enough to notice the changes in his worldview and emotional state. "I've learned many things, little one," he replied gently. "Important things about how we should treat other people, no matter where they come from." The adjustment to civilian life was challenging for multiple reasons. Germany in late 1945 was a country in ruins, struggling with massive food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and a population traumatized by defeat and the revelations of wartime atrocities. Medical facilities were particularly hard hit, with many hospitals destroyed and critical supplies unavailable. However, Kruger's experience with Allied medical techniques and his documentation from American physicians made him valuable to relief organizations working to rebuild Germany's healthcare system. Within weeks of his WWII release, he was approached by representatives of the International Red Cross to help establish emergency medical facilities for displaced persons in the Munich area. The work was physically demanding and emotionally draining, but it provided Kruger with a sense of purpose and continuity with his wartime experience of treating patients regardless of nationality or political affiliation. The displaced persons camps housed refugees from across Europe, including former concentration camp survivors, ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, and foreign workers who had been brought to Germany during the war. Treating Holocaust survivors was particularly challenging for Kruger, given his complicated feelings about German responsibility for their suffering. However, his experience working with former enemies in the American field hospital had taught him that healing required moving beyond guilt and blame to focus on immediate human needs. "I cannot undo what was done to you," he told one elderly Jewish survivor from Poland during a particularly difficult consultation. "But I can try to help you heal and regain your strength." The man studied Kruger's face carefully before responding. "You were a Wehrmacht doctor," he said, not as an accusation but as a statement of fact. "Yes," Kruger replied honestly. "I was. But you are here now, helping people like me. That means something." Such interactions reinforced Kruger's growing belief that redemption was possible through dedicated service to universal human values rather than narrow national interests. His work in the displaced persons camps became a form of personal atonement, an attempt to use his medical skills to heal some of the wounds inflicted by the regime he had unknowingly served. Meanwhile, Falk's reintegration followed a similar pattern but in different circumstances. Released 3 weeks after Kruger, he returned to Hamburg to find his childhood home destroyed by Allied bombing, but his elderly parents alive and staying with relatives in the suburbs. The reunion was bittersweet, marked by joy at survival but also by the harsh realities of post-war life. Hamburg had been devastated by Operation Demora, the massive Allied bombing campaign of July 1943, and much separate of the city remained in ruins 2 years later. "Ernst, thank God you're alive," his mother wept when she saw him. "We heard nothing for so long. We feared the worst." Falk's father, a retired professor of literature, was more reserved but equally emotional. "The country we knew is gone," he said quietly during their first private conversation. Everything we believed in, everything we thought was permanent, has been destroyed. We must find new ways to live." These words proved prophetic as Falk began seeking opportunities to resume his medical career. His specialty in reconstructive surgery was desperately needed in a country filled with wounded veterans and civilian casualties, but medical facilities lacked the equipment and supplies necessary for complex surgical procedures. The solution came through his correspondence with Allied medical personnel. Dr. Hayes had connected him with representatives of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, an international organization working to address humanitarian crises throughout war-torn Europe. UNRWA was establishing medical facilities across Germany and needed experienced surgeons willing to work with international teams. Falk's application was quickly approved, aided by strong recommendations from his former Allied colleagues and his documented experience treating patients of all nationalities during his captivity. Within 2 months of his release, he was assigned to a UNRWA hospital in Frankfurt, working alongside British, American, and French medical personnel to treat refugees and displaced persons. The multinational environment felt familiar after his months in the American field hospital, but it also presented new challenges. Many of his international colleagues viewed German medical personnel with suspicion, despite official policies promoting cooperation and reconciliation. Falk found himself having to prove his competence and reliability repeatedly, drawing on the patience and diplomatic skills he had developed during his captivity. His breakthrough came during a complex surgical case involving a young Hungarian refugee who had suffered severe facial injuries during the liberation of Budapest. The surgery required expertise in reconstructive techniques that few of the Allied surgeons possessed, and initial attempts at treatment had been unsuccessful. "Dr. Falk," announced Dr. James Morrison, the British chief of surgery, "we'd like you to evaluate this patient. Your experience with facial reconstruction may be relevant." The patient was a 17-year-old girl whose face had been severely damaged by shrapnel from a Soviet artillery shell. Previous surgical attempts had failed to restore function to her jaw, and she was unable to eat solid food or speak clearly. The psychological trauma was as severe as the physical injuries, and she had withdrawn into almost complete silence. Falk spent hours examining the girl's injuries and reviewing the previous surgical interventions. The case was extremely complex, requiring multiple procedures to rebuild damaged bone structure and restore nerve function. More importantly, it would require gaining the trust of a patient who had suffered terribly and had little reason to believe that another surgery would be successful. "The damage is extensive," Falk explained to Dr. Morrison and the assembled surgical team. "But I believe we can restore most of her facial function through a series of carefully planned procedures. The key is to rebuild the bone structure first, then work on soft tissue reconstruction and nerve repair." The surgery took place over several sessions spanning 3 weeks. Falk worked with meticulous precision, drawing on techniques he had developed during his military service and refined during his time with American surgeons. The international surgical team observed his methods carefully, initially skeptical, but gradually impressed by his skill and dedication. The girl's recovery was slow but remarkable. Gradually, her ability to eat and speak returned, and with it came a transformation in her psychological state. She began to interact with medical staff and other patients, eventually learning enough German to communicate directly with Falk about her treatment and recovery. Doctor," she said during one of their final consultations, the German words carefully pronounced despite her accent. "You gave me back my face, but more than that, you gave me back my hope." The successful treatment established Falk's reputation within the UNRWA medical community and opened doors for expanded responsibilities. He was invited to serve as a consultant on complex reconstructive cases throughout the organization's European operations, traveling to displaced persons camps and emergency hospitals across the continent. These travels exposed him to the full scope of the war's human cost. He treated concentration camp survivors bearing the physical and psychological scars of systematic persecution, refugees who had lost everything in ethnic cleansing campaigns, and children who had been orphaned by the violence that swept across Europe between 1939 and 1945. Each case reinforced his growing conviction that medical professionals had a special responsibility to serve all humanity rather than narrow national interests. The skills and knowledge he possessed were not German or Allied but universal, meant to be used for the benefit of anyone who suffered regardless of their nationality, ethnicity, or political beliefs. This philosophy was put to the test when Falk was assigned to treat former SS officers who had been injured during their capture or detention. Many of his international colleagues refused to work on such cases, arguing that medical resources should be reserved for the victims rather than the perpetrators of war crimes. Falk understood their perspective, but could not accept the logic of denying medical care based on political considerations. A patient is a patient, he argued during heated staff meetings. If we start deciding who deserves treatment based on their past actions, we stop being doctors and become judges. His position was controversial, but ultimately vindicated when one of the former SS officers he treated provided crucial testimony in war crimes trials that led to the conviction of several higher-ranking GA perpetrators. The medical care Falk provided had not only saved a life but contributed to the pursuit of justice for the regime's victims. Meanwhile, Kruger's work in Munich was evolving in different but parallel directions. His success in establishing medical facilities for displaced persons had brought him to the attention of American occupation authorities, who were seeking German professionals to help rebuild the country's civilian institutions. In early 1946, he was offered a position as medical director for the displaced persons camp at Fehrenwald, one of the largest facilities housing Holocaust survivors and other refugees in the American zone. The appointment was significant not only because of the responsibilities involved, but because it represented a level of trust that few former Wehrmacht personnel had achieved. The camp housed over 4,000 residents representing dozens of nationalities and ethnic groups. Many were Holocaust survivors, waiting for immigration opportunities to Palestine, America, or other countries willing to accept them. Others were ethnic Germans, expelled from Czechoslovakia, Poland, and other Eastern European countries where they had lived for generations. Managing medical care for such a diverse population required not only clinical skills but cultural sensitivity and diplomatic finesse. Kruger found himself serving as translator, cultural mediator, and psychological counselor as well as physician. His experience working with Allied medical personnel during his captivity proved invaluable in navigating the complex interpersonal dynamics of the camp. The most challenging cases involved Holocaust survivors suffering from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. These patients required not only medical treatment for physical ailments, but careful psychological support to help them process the trauma of their experiences. Kruger worked closely with Dr. Rachel Goldman, a Jewish psychiatrist from New York who had volunteered to work with Holocaust survivors in displaced persons camps. Their collaboration was initially awkward, given their backgrounds on opposite sides of the war, but gradually developed into a genuine professional partnership based on shared commitment to their patients' welfare. I must admit, Dr. Goldman told him during one of their regular case consultations, "I was skeptical about working with a former Wehrmacht officer, but your dedication to these patients is evident, and your clinical skills are excellent." Kruger appreciated her honesty. "I understand your initial reservations," he replied. "I struggle myself with the contradiction of having served a regime that caused such suffering while now trying to help its victims heal. But I believe this work is one way to honor the medical oath I took and perhaps make some small amend for the crimes committed in Germany's name." Their partnership became a model for post-war reconciliation efforts, demonstrating that former enemies could work together effectively when united by shared professional values and humanitarian goals. Dr. Goldman later wrote about their collaboration in medical journals, emphasizing the importance of moving beyond historical grievances to address immediate human needs. The success of both doctors in their post-war medical careers was significantly enhanced by the relationships they had formed during their captivity. Letters of recommendation from Allied medical personnel opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed to former Wehrmacht officers. More importantly, the personal connections they had made provided ongoing support and professional development opportunities. Dr. Hayes maintained regular correspondence with both men, sharing information about medical advances and research opportunities. In 1947, he arranged for Falk to attend a medical conference in London, focused on reconstructive surgery techniques developed during the war. The trip was Falk's first return to Allied territory since his repatriation, and it represented a significant milestone in his professional rehabilitation. The conference was attended by surgeons from across Europe and North America, many of whom had developed innovative techniques while treating war casualties. Falk's presentation on facial reconstruction methods was well received, and he was invited to collaborate on research projects with colleagues from several countries. "It's remarkable," commented Dr. Geoffrey Patterson, a British surgeon who had treated injuries during the London Blitz. "Here we are, former enemies, sharing knowledge that will benefit patients around the world. This is what medical science should be about." Such exchanges became increasingly common as the immediate post-war period gave way to the early stages of European reconstruction. Medical knowledge transcended political boundaries, and the expertise gained during the war years was too valuable to be restricted by nationalistic considerations. Colonel Carter, now returned to civilian practice in Boston, played a crucial role in facilitating these professional exchanges. He organized informal networks of former military medical personnel, including the German doctors who had served in his field hospital, to share information and coordinate research efforts. In 1948, he invited both Kruger and Falk to contribute chapters to a medical textbook he was editing on battlefield surgical techniques. The book, titled Trauma Surgery in Wartime: Lessons from the European Theater, became a standard reference work in emergency medicine and established both German doctors as recognized experts in their fields. "Your experience treating casualties from multiple armies gives you a unique perspective," Carter wrote in his invitation. "The techniques you developed and the insights you gained transcend the political context in which they occurred. They belong to the entire medical community." The publication of their contributions marked a symbolic milestone in their professional rehabilitation. Former Wehrmacht medical officers were now recognized as legitimate contributors to international medical knowledge, their expertise valued despite their wartime service on the losing side. This professional recognition had practical implications as well. Both doctors found themselves in increasing demand as consultants and speakers at medical conferences throughout Europe and North America. Their unique combination of wartime experience and post-war humanitarian service made them valuable voices in discussions about medical ethics and the role of healthcare professionals in promoting passion. Reconciliation. By 1950, both men had established themselves as leaders in their respective fields. Kruger had been appointed to a senior position with the World Health Organization, newly established as a specialized agency of the United Nations. His work focused on emergency medical response in refugee situations, drawing directly on his experience in displaced persons camps. Falk had opened a private practice in Munich, specializing in reconstructive surgery, but he continued to volunteer with international relief organizations, working in crisis areas around the world. His reputation for treating patients regardless of their background or ability to pay attracted clients from across Europe and beyond. The transformation from captured Wehrmacht officers to respected international medical professionals represented more than personal success. It demonstrated the possibility of redemption and reconciliation, even after the most devastating conflicts. Their story became a symbol of hope for those working to rebuild Europe on foundations of democracy, human rights, and international cooperation. The lessons they had learned in Colonel Carter's field hospital, that healing could transcend the artificial boundaries created by war and politics, continued to guide their professional and personal lives. They had discovered that medical ethics represented universal human values that could bridge even the deepest divisions created by conflict and hatred. Years later, when both men were asked to reflect on their wartime experiences and subsequent careers, they invariably returned to those months in American captivity as the turning point in their understanding of medicine and their responsibility as physicians. The trust placed in them by their former enemies had not been misplaced, and their response to that trust had opened possibilities for reconciliation that seemed impossible during the darkest days of the war. Their story stood as testament to the power of human decency to overcome even the most bitter divisions. proving that healing and hope could emerge from the ruins of conflict when people had the courage to reach across the barriers that separated them. In learning to see their former enemies as fellow human beings deserving of compassion and care, they had discovered not only their own capacity for growth and redemption, but the foundation for building a more peaceful and just world. The 1950s brought new challenges and opportunities for both doctors as Europe gradually emerged from the shadows of war. The establishment of NATO and the beginning of the Cold War created fresh tensions, but also reinforced the importance of international cooperation in addressing humanitarian crises. Both Kruger and Falk found themselves increasingly involved in efforts to bridge the growing divide between East and West through medical diplomacy. Kruger's position with the World Health Organization required him to travel extensively throughout Europe, often crossing the emerging Iron Curtain to coordinate medical relief efforts in Soviet-controlled crack territories. These missions were delicate diplomatic exercises, as much as medical operations, requiring careful navigation of political sensitivities while maintaining focus on humanitarian objectives. During a particularly challenging assignment in Poland in 1952, Kruger encountered a situation that brought back vivid memories of his wartime service. He was leading a WHO team investigating a tuberculosis outbreak in refugee camps near Warsaw when he met Dr. Stanislaw Kowalski, a Polish physician who had been imprisoned in a German concentration camp for treating Jewish patients during the occupation. The initial meeting was tense, with Dr. Kowalski clearly uncomfortable working with a former Wehrmacht officer. However, as they collaborated to address the medical crisis, professional respect gradually overcame historical grievances. Kowalski was impressed by Kruger's competence and dedication, while Kruger was humbled by the Polish doctor's resilience and commitment to healing despite his traumatic experiences. "You know," Kowalski said during a quiet moment while reviewing patient charts, "I expected to hate any German doctor I met. But watching you work with these patients, I see only a physician trying to help people who are suffering." Kruger paused in his examination of a young boy with advanced tuberculosis. "I cannot change what Germany did to Poland or to you personally," he replied carefully. "But perhaps I can honor the memory of those who suffered by dedicating my life to preventing such suffering in the future." Their collaboration became a model for medical cooperation across the emerging political divisions of the Cold War. When the tuberculosis outbreak was successfully contained, both doctors co-authored a paper on disease prevention in refugee populations that was published in multiple international medical journals. Meanwhile, Falk's private practice in Munich was becoming increasingly international in scope. His reputation for reconstructive surgery had spread beyond Europe, attracting patients from across the globe. However, his most meaningful work continued to be with victims of conflict and persecution who could not afford private medical care. In 1953, he established the International Foundation for Reconstructive Surgery, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing specialized surgical care to victims of war and violence worldwide. The foundation was funded through a combination of donations, government grants, and proceeds from Falk's private practice, allowing him to organize medical missions to crisis areas around the world. The foundation's first major operation was in Korea, where the ongoing conflict had created thousands of casualties requiring reconstructive surgery. Falk led a team of international surgeons to Seoul, working in conditions that reminded him of his wartime service, but with the crucial difference that they were treating patients regardless of which side of the conflict represented. War creates the same injuries, whether the victims are North Korean, South Korean, Chinese, or American, he observed in his mission report. Burns, shrapnel wounds, and blast injuries affect human tissue in identical ways. Our responsibility as physicians is to heal these injuries without regard to the political circumstances that caused them. The Korean mission established Falk's reputation as a pioneer in international medical humanitarian work. His innovative surgical techniques, combined with his philosophy of treating all patients equally, influenced a generation of surgeons who would later work with organizations like Doctors Without Borders and the BOSS, International Red Cross. The personal lives of both doctors were also evolving during this period. Kruger's marriage to Martha had been strengthened by their shared commitment to humanitarian work, and she often accompanied him on his WHO missions, serving as a nurse and translator. Their children, Klaus and Anna, grew up in an environment where international cooperation and service to others were fundamental values. Klaus, inspired by his father's example, chose to study medicine at the University of Munich, specializing in infectious diseases with the intention of following his father into international health work. Anna pursued a career in diplomacy, motivated by her understanding of how medical cooperation could bridge political divisions. Falk's personal life took a different trajectory. He married Dr. Sarah Weinstein, a Jewish-American surgeon he met during a medical conference in New York in 1954. Their marriage was controversial in some circles, given their backgrounds on opposite sides of the war, but it became a powerful symbol of reconciliation and healing. Sarah had lost family members in the Holocaust and initially struggled with conflicted feelings about marrying a former Wehrmacht officer. However, Falk's post-war dedication to treating Holocaust survivors and his genuine remorse for Germany's crimes convinced her that people could indeed change and grow beyond their past associations. "Ernst represents the Germany that could have been," she wrote to her parents when announcing their engagement. His life since the war shows that even those who served a terrible regime can find redemption through service to others. Their wedding was attended by colleagues from around the world, including several of Falk's former Allied associates from the field hospital. Colonel Carter, now in his 60s but still practicing medicine, delivered a speech that captured the significance of the occasion. "This marriage represents more than the union of two individuals," he said. "It symbolizes the triumph of love and healing over hatred and division. Ernst and Sarah have chosen to build their future on hope rather than fear, on cooperation rather than conflict." The couple's honeymoon was spent on a medical mission to Morocco, where they worked together to establish surgical facilities in rural areas lacking adequate medical care. This pattern of combining personal and professional commitments to humanitarian service would characterize their marriage for decades to come. By the late 1950s, both Kruger and Falk had achieved international recognition for their contributions to medicine and humanitarian work. They were frequently invited to speak at medical conferences and universities, sharing their experiences and insights with new generations of physicians. Their presentations often focused on the ethical dimensions of medical practice, particularly the responsibility of healthcare professionals to serve all humanity, rather than narrow national or political interests. These talks were especially powerful because of their personal journey from enemy soldiers to respected humanitarian workers. During a particularly memorable lecture at Harvard Medical School in 1958, Kruger addressed an audience of medical students and faculty about the lessons he had learned from his wartime experiences. "Medicine is perhaps the most universal of human endeavors," he began. "Disease and injury affect all people equally, regardless of their nationality, religion, or political beliefs. As physicians, we have the privilege and responsibility to heal without discrimination. This principle was taught to me not in medical school, but in an American field hospital where I was a prisoner of war." He went on to describe his experiences treating American soldiers while in captivity, emphasizing how the trust shown by Colonel Carter and his medical team had transformed his understanding of professional duty and international relations. "Those American doctors and nurses could have treated me as an enemy," he continued. "Instead, they treated me as a colleague. That experience taught me that our common humanity is stronger than the artificial divisions created by politics and war." The lecture received a standing ovation, and several students approached Kruger afterward to discuss opportunities for international humanitarian work. These conversations led to the establishment of an exchange program between Harvard Medical School and European medical institutions, facilitating international collaboration in medical education and research. Falk had similar impact during his speaking engagements, particularly when addressing the complex ethical challenges faced by medical professionals during wartime. His frank discussions of his own moral struggles and eventual transformation resonated with audiences around the world. During a symposium at the Royal College of Surgeons in London in 1959, he addressed the question of medical neutrality in conflict situations. Neutrality in medicine does not mean indifference, he explained to an audience of British surgeons. It means treating all patients with equal dedication, while maintaining clear moral principles about the preservation of human life and dignity. Sometimes this requires difficult choices, including the willingness to challenge authority when necessary. His comments sparked intense discussion about the role of medical professionals in political situations, with many participants sharing their own experiences of ethical dilemmas during wartime service. The symposium resulted in the publication of new guidelines for medical conduct during armed conflicts, guidelines that would influence international humanitarian law for decades to come. The relationship between Kruger, Falk, and their former Allied colleagues continued to deepen throughout the 1950s and 60s. Dr. Hayes organized regular reunions for personnel who had served in Colonel Carter's field hospital, bringing together Americans, British, Canadians, and the 2 German doctors for informal conferences on medical advances and humanitarian issues. These gatherings served multiple purposes beyond professional networking. They provided opportunities for participants to process their wartime experiences in a supportive environment, share updates on their post-war careers and families, and discuss ongoing challenges in POW, international medical cooperation. The reunions also became laboratories for developing new approaches to post-conflict medical care. Participants shared experiences from recent humanitarian missions, compared techniques for treating trauma patients, and collaborated on research projects that would benefit the broader medical community. Colonel Carter, though officially retired, remained actively involved in these networks until his death in 1967. His funeral was attended by hundreds of medical professionals from around the world, including both Kruger and Falk, who served as pallbearers alongside their former American colleagues. "He taught us that healing transcends nationality," Falk said during his eulogy. Benjamin Carter was a soldier, but he was a healer first. His legacy lives on in every patient we treat, every life we save, and every barrier we break down between former enemies. The 1960s brought new global challenges that tested the principles both doctors had learned during their wartime service. The Vietnam War, various African independence struggles, and ongoing Cold War tensions created fresh humanitarian crises requiring international medical intervention. Kruger found himself coordinating WHO responses to refugee situations in Southeast Asia, often working in dangerous conditions near active combat zones. His experience treating battlefield casualties proved invaluable in establishing emergency medical facilities for civilians displaced by fighting in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. During one particularly difficult mission in 1965, he worked alongside American military medical personnel in Vietnam, treating both military and civilian casualties. The irony of collaborating with American forces 20 years after his capture was not lost on him, but it reinforced his conviction that medical cooperation could transcend political divisions. "History has come full circle," he wrote to his wife from Saigon. "Once again, I find myself working with American medical personnel to save lives. The circumstances are different, but the fundamental mission remains the same: to heal those who suffer, regardless of which side of the conflict they represent." Falk's Foundation expanded its operations during this period, establishing permanent surgical facilities in several African countries, gaining independence from colonial rule. These missions often required working in areas with minimal infrastructure and limited resources, challenges that reminded him of his wartime service, but with the crucial difference that he was now serving purely humanitarian rather than military objectives. His work in newly independent Congo in 1964 brought him face to face with the complexities of post-colonial medical care. Local physicians, many of whom had received limited training under colonial regimes, were struggling to address massive health challenges with inadequate resources and equipment. Falk's approach was to work alongside local medical personnel rather than imposing foreign solutions, sharing his expertise while learning from their understanding of local conditions and cultural practices. This collaborative model became a template for international medical assistance programs throughout Africa and Asia. "The goal is not to create dependency on foreign medical assistance," he explained in a report to Foundation donors. "Rather, it is to build local capacity while providing immediate relief to those who suffer." Our job is to work ourselves out of a job by training local physicians and establishing sustainable medical systems. As both doctors entered their 60s, they began to focus more on training the next generation of international medical workers. Kruger established a fellowship program at WHO headquarters in Geneva, providing young physicians with experience in international health crisis response. Falk created a similar program through his foundation, offering surgical training combined with humanitarian field experience. These educational initiatives became their most lasting legacy, influencing thousands of young medical professionals who would carry forward their principles of medical neutrality and international cooperation. Many of these trainees would later establish their own humanitarian organizations or serve in leadership positions with existing international medical agencies. The impact of their wartime experience continued to influence their approach to medical education. Both men emphasized the importance of treating patients as human beings first, political entities second. They taught their students to see beyond nationality, religion, and ideology to focus on fundamental human needs for healing and compassion. A good physician, Kruger often told his fellows, is one who can see the humanity in every patient, even under the most difficult circumstances. This skill is learned not just through medical training, but through life experience that teaches empathy and understanding. As the 1970s began, both doctors could look back on careers that had transformed them from captured enemy soldiers into respected international humanitarian leaders. Their journey from the ruins of Aachen to positions of global influence in medical diplomacy represented not just personal redemption, but proof that the human capacity for growth and change could overcome even the deepest divisions created by war and ideology. The trust placed in them by Colonel Carter and his medical team in that field hospital in 1944 had been vindicated many times over through decades of service to global health and humanitarian causes. Their story continued to inspire new generations of medical professionals who saw in their example proof that healing could indeed transcend all artificial boundaries between human beings.